All right, so we're going over chapter 4 on tissues, okay? So there's 4 tissues in the body: epithelial, connective, muscle, and neural. Muscle tissue and neural tissue, pretty easy. Epithelial tissue, not so bad, a little more difficult. Connective tissue just seems like it just is, it's huge. So we're going to try to break it down so that you guys can understand these a little bit better. We're going to start with epithelial tissue. First, epithelial tissue covers the skin and mucous membranes. It covers surfaces. So your skin, that's an epithelial tissue. Inside your mouth, that's an epithelial tissue. Okay? Inside your blood vessels and your digestive tract, those are epithelial tissues. Right? Epithelial tissues can also be specialized to secrete fluids, and so those we call glands. So your salivary glands that secrete saliva, those are epithelial tissues that are called, that's a gland. Your sweat glands, epithelial tissue. Okay, so some of the epithelial tissues can be specialized. We're going to classify the epithelial tissue in 2 ways based on how many layers are there. If there's 1 layer, it's a simple epithelium. If there's multiple layers, it's a stratified epithelium. The shape of the cells is another way that we classify these epithelial tissues. A squamous cell is squatty, thin, and flat. Okay, sometimes we call it squamous or squamous, whichever way you say it, but those are squatty. They're real thin and flat. Cuboidal cells are square in the shape of a cube, and then columnar cells, those are tall and rectangular. So let's look at the squamous cells. Simple squamous, that means how many layers? 1. So it's 1 layer of thin cells. 1 layer of thin cells. They're thin. That means things can get across it easily. Things like oxygen and nutrients can cross really easily. Okay, they're that thin. When we look at the picture here, it's so thin we can't see it on edge. Instead, we have to look at it from the top. That's why when you look at this, you say, oh, it looks like there's a lot of layers there. There's not. It's just that we can't see the edge of it. We have to look at the top of it because it's so thin. So where would we need that type of thin tissue? It's going to be in your capillaries, in the alveoli, and the little air sacs. Those are areas where we have to oxygen has to cross over really fast. So we're going to see it there. And this is a picture of the peritoneal cavity, so we can see it there as well. Stratified squamous, if we look at that, again, here's the tissue. So this is many layers of the squamous cells. If you look at the bottom here, you're going to say, no, that looks like cuboidal. Well, don't look at the bottom. Don't look at where it attaches to the rest of the body. Where it attaches, that's called the basement membrane. Look at the top layer, where it's exposed. This is the exposed surface up here. Those cells look thin and flat. They look like squamous. So that's stratified squamous. That's going to be found in areas, it's thick. So it's going to be found in areas where there's a lot of friction, like inside your mouth. There's a lot of friction from saliva and food and your teeth and tongues and your tongue and things like that. It's going to be found in the vagina and the rectum. It's just thick. So whenever we see a thick tissue, we think, oh, that's used for protection. When we see a thin tissue, that means, oh, that's used to get things across it easily. All right? So these 2 diagrams would be on your lab exam. This diagram, if you saw that, you would say that's simple squamous. If you saw this diagram, you would say that's stratified squamous. Okay, this is cuboidal. We have simple cuboidal and stratified cuboidal. Simple cuboidal, right here, this lines the kidney tubules. This is one of the areas where we can find it. It lines the kidney tubules. So those cells are square. They're a little bit bigger than squamous, but still there's only 1 layer of them, so things can get across them. So when you have water in here, water can leave the tubule and go back into your body. Nutrients like glucose and amino acids, they can leave the tubule and go back into your body. Okay, sodium, chloride, they can leave and go back into your body. They can cross that barrier. Okay, so that's simple cuboidal. It's somewhat thicker, so it has a little bit of protection because those cells, even though there's only one layer, they're thicker than the squamous. So there's just a little bit of protection with those. And then we have the stratified cuboidal, which we see down here, and these are rare. We don't see these many places. This is a cross-section of one of the sweat gland ducts. So it's a cross-section, and you can see all of the cells in there look very cuboidal. They look like cubes, and there's more than one layer of those. So that's stratified cuboidal. Okay, it's thick, 2 layers, so it's protective. The columnar cells, they're going to be tall and narrow. They're like rectangles. Usually it's simple columnar. When we look at simple columnar, on the top of those, we typically see microvilli. So microvilli are, they increase the surface area of a cell so that anything that is on the surface can be absorbed into the cell and then into the body. So where would we find that, do you think, in the body? Where do we absorb things? In the intestines, in the digestive system, right? So that's where we're going to find simple columnar, in the intestines, okay? Then there's stratified columnar. Stratified columnar, that's several layers, so this is protection again. It's thick. It's not to bring things across it. This is, right here, what you're seeing, the stratified columnar is from one of your salivary glands called the parotid glands. Those are the glands that get really big when a person has the mumps. So we're taking a look at a cross-section of that salivary gland duct. But there's other areas that we find this as well, like in your throat, and in your epiglottis, which is where your food goes down to your stomach. We're going to see this. It's very protective. There's a lot of friction. A lot of that food's going down into your throat, and it's rubbing up against those layers, right? So we need it to be thick so that it's protective. Okay, so it protects your throat. Now, when we look at them, again, you look at the layers that are close to the basement membrane, and you say, they look like cubes. That's got to be cuboidal. No, again, we want to look at the cells that are closest to the surface. So here's the lumen of this salivary duct. Okay, there's the lumen. These are the cells that are close to that surface. Those look like columnar. So we say that is stratified columnar, right? You'll see these two on the lab exam. Then we have this one. This one's called transitional. Now this one has the ability to change shape. So sometimes it looks columnar, and then sometimes it looks cuboidal. Actually, sometimes it looks more cuboidal, and then sometimes it looks more squamous. So it moves from the transitional epithelium changes shape. The cells move from cuboidal to squamous, to cuboidal to squamous. They have the ability to stretch. So we find these in organs where they stretch, like your urinary bladder. So when your bladder is empty and it's not stretched, it looks cuboidal. And then your bladder fills up with urine and it stretches and they look squamous, right? So it's transitional. And you'll see this diagram on your lab exam. Then we have pseudostratified columnar. Now, pseudo means false, so it's falsely layered, and it's columnar. Most of the time, this type of tissue has cilia on the top of them, so we can see the cilia. Those are long finger-like projections up there. Cilia move things across the surface of the cell, and we said we find those where? In the respiratory tract, because we're trying to move the mucus and the dust back up. So we would find this in the respiratory tract, right? That's where we would find this. So what makes it pseudostratified? So you don't see clear layers. You don't have a bottom layer, a middle layer, and a top layer. Instead, some of the cells on the top are actually going to go down into the middle layer. Some of them might even go all the way down to the bottom layer. So they are pseudostratified. It's falsely stratified, falsely layered, right? So that's pseudostratified columnar. Mostly have cilia on top, so we find it in the respiratory tract. Then we have glands, and you have to understand glands, again, are epithelial tissue. So you want to make sure that you understand the 3 methods on how these glands produce. So these are all columnar cells. They're all columnar cells, and they're all secreting something. Say the top one is merocrine secretion. That one's secreting saliva. Okay. The middle one here, this is the apocrine secretion. The apocrine secretion is secreting breast milk. Okay. And then the bottom one here is a holocrine secretion. The holocrine secretion we're going to find on a sebaceous gland, which is attached to your hair follicle, and that secretes this oily substance that we call sebum. So they're each secreting something different, but it's how they secrete that gives them their name, right? So a merocrine secretion, when we look at this, we can see that little vesicles are being formed, and the vesicles are releasing that saliva out of the cell. And we call that process exocytosis. So in the merocrine secretion with salivary glands, they release saliva through exocytosis. Nothing happens to the cell. The cell remains intact. It's completely the same cell as it always has been. It just releases its secretion through that process. Then we have the apocrine secretions here. Again, this is like breast milk. This is how breast milk is released from the mammary gland into the ducts where it can be released for lactation. So here we have the columnar cells. What happens here is a little bit of that cytoplasm pinches off in the apocrine secretion. So now we get the vesicles that are filled with the milk. You know, the cell produced the milk, and the milk was packaged in these little vesicles. But then we get the whole part of the cell pinches off and gets released. Not the part of the cell with the nucleus. So the cell still is there and still can continue to produce milk, but there's a part of the cell that pinches off. So in breast milk, that baby is getting part of mom's, the carbohydrates and the proteins that are in the cell membrane. They're getting any of the organelles that are inside that little piece of cell. Maybe there's antibodies in there, right? There's enzymes in there. There's the milk in there. So the baby's getting part of mom's cell. That's the apocrine secretion. And then finally we have the holocrine secretion. Holocrine secretions, again, we find those in those sebaceous glands that release sebum. And so in this case, the entire cell is going to burst. So what comes out in that sebum is everything. The nucleus of the cell membrane, all of the cytoplasm, everything comes out in that secretion. It just bursts, right? So when the forensics guys, they find a piece of hair, if it has enough of that hair root on it, possibly it's going to have some of that DNA on it, right, from the nucleus. So we see that the bottom, though it's in multiple layers, the bottom layer of cells, those are going through mitosis because they're going to produce a daughter cell that's going to replace the cells that just exploded. Okay, so those are glands. Then we have connective tissues. So connective tissues are three groups of connective tissues. Connective tissues are deep in the body. They're deep in the body, and they kind of are in between parts. So they have many different functions. There's three groups of connective tissues. We're going to go through those, and then, like I said, that's the biggest part. This is the biggest one, and then we'll quickly go through muscle and neural, take a break, and then we'll go through the Chapter 5 model. Let you guys do that while I set up the mock lab exam. Okay? All right, so connective tissue proper. First of all, let me tell you about connective tissue. All connective tissue, no matter which group it's from, has special cells, has protein fibers, and has ground substance. So the ground substance is just what is the material in between the fibers and the special cells. That's what ground substance is. Sometimes you'll hear us talk about matrix. Matrix is just the protein fibers and ground substance together. So sometimes we'll talk about the cells and the matrix. Okay. So the connective tissue proper contains all of these specialized cells. And you'll need to know the function of each one of these. Now, this is the only one that has this many, all right? Some of the connective tissue proper will only have one type of cell, like adipose tissue will only have adipose cells. But then we have another type of connective tissue proper called areolar tissue, and that will have all of these. So let me briefly go over what each one of these things do. The fibroblasts, they're going to produce those protein fibers. The fibrocytes, they repair the protein fibers. The macrophages, they engulf any pathogens that get into that tissue, like bacteria, things like that. Toxins. Lymphocytes, they're going to help to produce antibodies. Mast cells, they produce histamine and heparin. Histamine and heparin are going to dilate blood vessels and bring more fluid to the area and kind of cause inflammation. Adipose cells, they store triglycerides, which is fat. Melanocytes, they produce melanin. So not all of the tissue, the only areolar tissue that has that is going to be the areolar tissue in the skin. Melanin is a skin pigment. And then we have mesenchymal cells, which are stem cells. So again, if you don't get all this down, I am recording this so you will be able to see this again. So this is all the different cells. You can see this is areolar tissue basically that has all the different types of cells. If you saw this on a lab exam, you would say, oh, that's all those different types of cells. That's areolar tissue. Okay. But anyway, I'm going to go through the different categories of connective tissue proper here. I just wanted you to see all of those different types of cells. We have, here's a macrophage, here's the melanocyte, here's another macrophage, here's the fibroblast, here's a mesenchymal cell, there's a lymphocyte, there's the adipose cells, there's a mast cell up here in the corner. So we have a whole lot of all those cells in there. And then connective tissue proper also contains all three of these protein fibers. Contains reticular fibers, elastic fibers, and collagen fibers. So those are the different fibers, and the ground substance in connective tissue is syrupy. Again, let's look at this picture here. Up here we see reticular fibers. So those are kind of in a stroma. They can be pulled, make the tissue, allow it to be pulled in many directions. Here we have elastic fibers. Those allow the tissue to be pulled and then go back to its original shape. And then these big yellow things here, those are the collagen fibers, and they allow the fiber to bend and come back to its original shape. So again, this is a tissue which has all three types of those protein fibers. The other types of connective tissue might only have one of those fibers or two of those fibers, but not all of those types of fibers. And then in connective tissue proper, all this pink stuff in between, that's the ground substance, and it's syrupy. It's like a syrupy fluid inside connective tissue proper. So anyway, let's go over connective tissue proper. All right, let's go over the different categories. Connective tissue proper can be loose or dense. If it's loose, that means there's more ground substance and fewer fibers, and the fibers are not tightly packed together. If it's dense, that means there's less ground substance and the fibers are tightly packed together. So let's look here. What do we have? This is loose connective tissue. The two that you have to know for lab and lecture are adipose tissue and areolar tissue. Adipose tissue. The fibers in here are not tightly packed together. In adipose tissue, we have these big yellow cells that are called adipocytes. They're fat cells. Okay, so they're dominated, this tissue is dominated by fat cells, and we find this in places like under your skin because it helps with insulation. Areolar tissue is the other type of connective tissue proper. This is the one that has all those specialized cells, has all three types of fibers, and so you can see this kind of mix with that. That's what areolar tissue kind of looks like with that. We also find that in the skin. So if we look at a skin model here, this is the superficial layer of skin, this is the dermis, and in the dermis, this is where we have areolar tissue. And underneath that, in the hypodermis, that's where we have adipose tissue. So we find both of those tissues in the skin. Okay, then so we had loose connective tissue, now we have dense connective tissue. They're both part of connective tissue proper. So let's look at dense connective tissue. In dense connective tissue, if it's regular, that means all the fibers are running in one direction. If they're running in one direction, that means you can pull on them and it's like a rope. So we find that in tendons, okay, the tendons that you have that attach your muscle to your bone. If we have dense, irregular connective tissue, that's where the fibers are not running in the same direction. They're not running in the same direction. They're running in a whole bunch of different directions, so you can pull on them from different directions and it's pretty strong. We find that in the skin as well. So in the skin so far we see areolar tissue and we see dense irregular connective tissue. And then there's elastic tissue. Elastic tissue, the fibers are running in the same direction again, but now we have elastic fibers in there. So they're found in the ligaments in your spine, so you can bend and come back up, and your spine goes right back to where it's supposed to be. So that's connective tissue proper. Now there are some things that are called membranes. I want to talk about this before I go on to the next group of connective tissue. Membranes are in your body when you have one layer of epithelial tissue and one layer of connective tissue. And there's 4 different membranes. The mucous membranes up here, you can see this is the columnar, and then below here we have areolar. That's a mucous membrane. We find mucous membranes in the digestive tract. We find them in the digestive tract. Then we have serous membranes, and you guys know what those are. The pleura, the pericardium, the peritoneum, those are all serous membranes, right? So we find those as well in those areas. That's another membrane. We have the cutaneous membrane. This is chapter 5, so we're going to talk all about the skin, right, in chapter 5. And that's what the cutaneous membrane is. And then finally we have the synovial membrane, and the synovial membrane is a membrane that covers joints. It produces a fluid called synovial fluid inside your joints. So you do need to know the 4 different types of membranes, okay? Mucous, serous, cutaneous, and synovial. All right, then moving on to the second type of connective tissue. The second type of connective tissue is called fluid connective tissue. This one's easy, okay? This is an easy one. The fluids in your body are basically, you have intracellular fluid and you have extracellular fluid, okay? Intracellular fluids inside your cells, extracellular fluids outside your cells. So this fluid connective tissue is all the fluids outside your cells. It's the extracellular fluid. And that means that's blood, like plasma. That's the interstitial fluid, and then that's the lymph too, right? So what happens is the plasma moves from the blood vessels into the interstitial space, and then we call it interstitial fluid. And then the interstitial fluid moves from the interstitial space into lymphatic vessels, and then we call it lymph. And then the lymph moves from the lymphatic vessels back into the blood vessels, and then we call it plasma, or blood, right? Blood. Okay, so the fluid moves from one compartment to the next. So for the lab exam, all we're going to see is blood. And blood has 3 specialized blood cells. It has red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. And right here, you're just seeing the white blood cells. Okay, so you'll see a diagram that has those white blood cells plus the red blood cells. Right? All right, so that's fluid connective tissue. Then we have supporting connective tissue. And supporting connective tissue supports the body frame. There's 2 categories in here. And this is the end of connective tissue. Yay, right? We have cartilage and we have bone. Cartilage, we have hyaline cartilage, fibrous cartilage, and elastic cartilage. Bone, we have compact or spongy bone, right? So let's look at cartilage first. All cartilage contains chondrocytes. So that's the cell in cartilage. Chondrocytes are very distinct. To me, they look like eyeballs. This is a chondrocyte there. It has a really dark nucleus. The cell membrane stains really dark. So the nucleus and the cell membrane stain dark. Here again, you can see another one. Here you have the red cell membrane and the darker purple nucleus. To me, they just look like eyeballs. So we have chondrocytes here, chondrocytes here, chondrocytes here, right? They all look like kind of eyeballs to me. They're all similar. Chondrocytes are found in cartilage. This one, this top one, if we look at this is hyaline cartilage. It is the most common cartilage that we have. It's found on the ends of your long bones. So when the doctor says you have no cartilage left in your joint, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about that hyaline cartilage has been worn down because the bones are rubbing against each other and they wore down. So when we look under a microscope, we can see those chondrocytes, and they're in these little lacunae, which are little kind of like caves, because the ground substance out here, it's not syrupy anymore. Now it's like harder. It's hard. And so if you didn't have that little cave for those chondrocytes, they'd be crushed by the weight of that ground substance. So in hyaline cartilage, you can't see any of the fibers. When we look at elastic cartilage, you can see some fibers. Those are elastic fibers. So elastic cartilage we find in places where you think of elastic cartilage. That's like in your ear, where you get that pierced. That's in your ear auricle, right? And then we have fibrocartilage. And in fibrocartilage, all of those fibers are running in one direction. So they're found in like the discs in your intervertebral discs. So when a person has a herniated disc, it's because these fibers have been damaged. And now the inside of that disc is bulging out and touching that nerve, pinching on that nerve. So these three diagrams will be on your lab exam. You want to make sure you can know that, be able to identify those. Bone, in bone we just have the compact bone, and compact bone is arranged with osteons, with these circles. This ground substance is really hard. It's calcified. We pack calcium in that. So that bone is very hard. It has a hard ground substance. Okay. So you'll see that diagram, and you would just have to say bone. Another name for that is osseous tissue. And the cell in bone are called osteocytes. So in cartilage it's chondrocytes, in bone it's osteocytes. The osteocytes too are in little caves called lacunae because they would really be crushed by that calcified hard ground matrix. Finally, we get to muscle tissue. We're done with connective tissue. We get to muscle tissue. There's three different types of muscle tissue. Muscle tissue is, it contracts, it shortens, and it makes the muscle move, get smaller. So skeletal muscle, you're going to see this picture of skeletal muscle, and you're going to see this picture of the tissue. It's striated, so we see stripes in it. It has more than one nucleus. This one cell here has more than one nucleus, so it's multinucleated. Skeletal muscle is voluntary. For lecture, you need to know it's voluntary because when you can tell it consciously contract, and it contracts. So it's voluntary, right? And it's attached to bone. So skeletal muscle attaches to bone. That's why it moves bones. When you shorten that muscle, it moves the bones. Cardiac muscle is found only in the heart. It is also striated, and it branches, so it looks different than this. This is a straight cell. These cells branch. So that's another clue, besides seeing the heart there, right? It is striped, and each cell only has one nucleus. The heart, do you think it's voluntary or involuntary? It's involuntary. You don't have to tell it to contract. And then we have smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is found in internal passageways. It's going to be in your blood vessels, in your digestive tract, anywhere you have, smooth muscles that are going to contract and move things. These cells are non-striated. You don't see that striped appearance. There's one nucleus. Do you think your intestines, when they move things through the intestines, do you think that's voluntary or involuntary? It's involuntary. You don't have to tell it to do it. You don't consciously tell it to do it, so it's involuntary. Okay, nervous tissue. Nervous tissue, this is how you send messages quickly through places in your body. So you can send a message very quickly through this nerve, this cell here, which is called a neuron. This is one of the special cells in nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is found in the brain, in the spinal cord, and in your nerves. right? That's all neural tissue, nervous tissue. So one type of cell is this neuron. That's what's going to send the electrical impulse. The other type of cell is the neuroglia, and the neuroglia is going to support it, protect it, maintain it, repair it, all of those things. So we have those two types of cells are in nervous tissue. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 4. So any questions on that? Right? Boom, in a nutshell.